So now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. So David Dean is a political educator, a writer, and speaker seeking to support the growth of transformative alliances in our social movements. Solidarity that undoes centuries-long project of reactionary elites that tried to divide and rule. He gives a particular focus to supporting white people to engage in multiracial movements with emotional strength, political clarity, and fierce purpose. He is the former associate director of White Awake, a racial and economic justice education center where he taught courses for more than 5,000 people and trained activists throughout the country. Again, our wonderful digital manager, Sarah, will be monitoring the chat, and after a brief discussion, we feature questions from our attendees. So please feel free to post to the panelists, and Sarah will also earmark those questions for our Q&A period. So welcome, David. Say hello to the good people.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Jasmine, and grateful to be here with all of you. And thank you all for being here today.
Yeah, well, I think I want to jump in with the first question that I really love to hear the answers to, because as you know, these atomized identities that we all have been assigned, and some of us have chosen of our own volition as well, don't always give us the answer to this question. So I'm going to ask it, and you can answer it however you feel comfortable. So who are your people, David? Help me and the audience know a bit more about who anchors you and your lineages.
Yeah. So my ancestors, and we'll talk more about this a little later today, come from primarily the British Isles, and were brought here, in the early 1600s and 1700s, and, have been a part of a lot of different political currents in our history, right? Have been used and weaponized as foot soldiers of this racial capitalist empire that we've seen emerge over the centuries. Some have actively resisted that, and been, one lineage that I feel really connected to is a Southern working class based multiracial organizing tradition that has encapsulated segments of populist organizing, socialist organizing, multiracial labor organizing that also fought against lynching, that brought people together across lines of difference, to challenge racism and ruling class power, and showing everybody their stake in that movement. So that's a central lineage that I try to connect with and bring forward, and carry forward in my work today. So.
Thank you. What a beautiful inheritance. So obviously your bio says so much about you, and I want you to tell us just a bit more about yourself and how you came to this work.
Yeah, totally. So, right, as you said, in the bio, right, what I'm doing now primarily is leading political education trainings for activists broadly, but also oftentimes specifically for white identified people, to cultivate, the emotional strength and the political clarity to be effective members of coalitions that can change this society. And the way that I got to doing that involved a lot of personal struggle and also personal growth, that started out in my early 20s, working for racial justice organizations led by Black folks and Indigenous people, in different capacities, and leading some, youth activism program under the guidance of folks that I worked for, working at an organization that was working to challenge the school to prison pipeline, which is, affecting so many working class Black and brown youth in around the country, but I was working in Oakland, California in an organization. As one of the few white folks working at at all of these places I worked at in my early 20s, I had to learn, and deepen my learning both about things like unconscious bias, but also about, a lot of the history of colonialism and racial violence in this country, right? And so learning about, the massive levels of genocidal land theft that happened through this country of the land of indigenous peoples, the connection between that colonialism and the oppression of Black people, and the ways in which vast tracts of land were taken, to pave the way for more and more plantations worked by the enslaved. The boarding school, the national boarding school program that stole, right, 100,000 Native youth from their homes, and told them that their culture was of the devil, right? And working in communities that were super impacted by that. And just learning all of this history and seeing the present day impacts of that in the communities that I was working in, right? And learning how to like be and do all the right things, quote unquote, as like a white person working in those contexts, and building meaningful relationships and doing important work, but kind of under the surface, right? Being stuck, number one, in a sense of political confusion, like what is my role here actually? It seemed like in some ways the cookie cutter models in our mainstream activist culture I was being given were related to like either being like a helper, or to around issues that didn't affect me in some way, right? That was what I was taught, or being this sort of like deferent ally, right? Where I'm just like supposed to shrink and totally defer. And sometimes I almost feel like I'm being encouraged to like glorify folks of color and not actually be in real relationship, right? Which is what we're really trying to do as we work for racial justice. Like, and struggling on the other hand with shame, right? And this idea, like stuck in this idea that like maybe all that I come from is just is only this legacy of racial violence. Maybe that's almost like inherent to who I am, inherent to everything that I am and my people come from. And maybe I'm just like messed up, right? And so I was kind of embarrassed about some of those emotions for a while, and I resisted them for a while. But I think what I resisted persisted, right? And got to the point where it was really like impacting my ability to do my work in a grounded way. And so some of what we're going to talk about in this session, is one of the things that really started to help me find emotional strength and find political clarity was diving deep into my history.
Yes.
And
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, what's so engaging for me about the work that you've done is it aligns with humanist values. One of obviously humanists, it's an individual, but can be applied as a collective practice and philosophy. And it's inherently progressive, but one of the anchoring principles that has stayed and values that has stayed since, the beginning of humanist history is free thought and being a free thinker. And what I began to see happening online, some of what I engaged in myself at the beginning of my politicization and understanding race and racial construct, particularly as a social construct, was sort of like this deference politics that ignited my own personal shame, that led me to shame and engage in sort of limiting others. And it was encapsulated in these slogans around just trust Black women or defer to whatever, right? It was always,
Right.
You don't get to think for yourself. This is not about you. You should just look to Black people, which ultimately, infantilizes the person who needs to be thinking and be autonomous, but then also puts so much onus on people of color. And then it invisibilizes the reality that this social construct of racial domination and this very simple binary hierarchical theory around like racism is just white people oppressing Black people completely invisibilizes the deep nuance, texture, and complexity of ethnicity, of identity, of like how people come into this conversation within the United States context. And so I loved your work and I was so drawn to it because it helped to create opportunities for folks, particularly folks who have been racialized as white, to re-engage their free thinking, to really figure out what they do believe, what they understand, informed by history. And that while you're a young person yourself, you are rooted in a long lineage of people who have been doing this work. And so you're bringing that information forward and you're bridging us into the present. Which brings me to my next question. Grace Lee Boggs, an incredible activist and Detroit organizer, and now an ancestor to so many of us in social transformation and movement spaces, used to ask this question. She would say, I want to know, what time is it on the world clock? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a time of like all of these intersecting crises. I mean, we have like one of the greatest, even in addition to racial violence, right, that we're seeing all the time, right, and racial inequality, right, we have one of the greatest levels, if not the greatest level of economic inequality, right, overall in U.S. history, right. We have this climate catastrophe that we can't figure out.
Mm-hmm.
How to address and build the political will to address.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we have, like you were talking about, like a politics that on the one hand, there are a lot of reactionary corporate driven political forces, that are explicitly using racism as a tool to divide and conquer, right? And are telling ordinary white people all around this country who are struggling in a lot of ways with massive crises, that the cause of their problems, are undocumented immigrants, are Muslims, are Black protesters, right? And on the other hand, you have a political, a liberal politics that is not identifying the root causes of suffering, right? Um, and is actually in some ways acting as if, working class rural white America is the root cause of suffering, right? In some ways,
Yeah.
and and not pointing to the broader forces of manipulation and ruling class power that are at play, and almost playing into the political right, in the sense of still framing our society as this like zero sum racial competition for limited economic resources,
Mm-hmm.
right? And um, and not actually having a politics that shows how everybody has a stake in coming together to create a better society, right? And even though we're in different positions within this system of racialized capitalism, like all of us have a fundamental stake in ending it. And I think that is the politics that we need to connect with, and like we've been saying, like digging into our history is a big way to show us what those politics are.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And what is so appealing and attractive to so many of the folks that are in these different spaces related to secular, realizing a pluralistic society and secular humanism, or non-theism more broadly, is this understanding that we all have a vested stake in improving the quality of humanity, right? We all have to intervene. And this, how you approach in your practices could be one that humanists adopt to intervene, especially because it's rooted in a scientific understanding of things,
Yeah.
right? This is evidence-based.
Right, right.
It's all evidence-based. We have the documentation that shows how ruling class and then through corporations, particularly post Citizens United and the rise of neoliberalism, were invested in this continuing of creating more and more partitions that separate us from ourselves and from others in order for them to amass wealth unchecked on the backs of so many folks.
Mm-hmm.
So with that in mind, since this is the way that you, with your free thinking and your history and all of your people adopt making change in the world, talk to us your perspective of the history of the creation of the white identity.
Yeah. Yeah, some of you all, may have read the essay that I wrote called "Roots Deeper Than Whiteness," which we suggested as pre-reading for this event. And some of that history is in there, and I will, go over that again because I think it's really powerful, and we see, right, like a pattern develop in this early history that is still with us today, and that has been repeated time and time again. And the first, I had mentors right after I was, I had mentors, actually mentors of color, who, 10 years ago or so were telling me that I needed to like understand who my people were before they were white. Right. And I didn't really know what that meant. And it wasn't like intuitive for me at first. Um, but after encouragement and after other factors in my life, I began really studying my history and realizing that whiteness was this social construct, right?
Mhm.
And that there was a Europe before empire, and there was a Europe that resisted and persisted in the face of empire for centuries, right? And actually, what we see is that, like, historically, so much of Europe, right, was engaged in this vast class struggle, right, from the time of like Roman colonialism of that whole continent through, through the time of, when people, basically like an anti-feudal struggle was emerging that grew to the point of such power that people in power in Western Europe were trying to figure out what to do to quell this people's movement that was actually gaining more autonomy. And the reaction, the response was actually capitalism and ultimately racial capitalism, where people were displaced from traditional communities, traditional lands, right? And um, to, number one, become like exploitable workers that the new economy required, and number two, right, in the 1600s, we start to see a number of people being essentially deported to the North American colonies, to serve as indentured servants within this new colonial project that was also a part of this economy that was growing. And so my ancestors, right, were a part of that early wave, right, of English people brought over here. And they arrived to Virginia, right, where there's like 50 ruling families that control most of the land. And they're actually on tobacco plantations, like working alongside unfree Africans as well as some indigenous people. And what we see is that there's actually, at this point in history, like much more similar conditions as well as stronger relationships between these groups than there soon would be. People, right, like intermarried sometimes, socialized together, toiled in fields together, um, and resisted together, both forming these like maroon communities on the outskirts of the colonies. There's like thousands of white people historically who ran away to live with tribal communities in that era, and in these like revolts in the mid-Atlantic colonies, right? One of which in 1676 lasted a year and literally almost toppled the Virginia government, right? Like the colonial Virginia government, a multiracial coalition, that did that, of poor people, of unfree people. And in response to that, um, white racial identity was created as a legal category by a ruling class trying to quell that threat to the colonial system. And
Mhm.
that meant that slight privileges were given to poor and indentured Europeans, which essentially created a shared identity across lines of class, a shared, right, like white identity where there was this like fabricated allegiance between poor white people and rich white people who were in charge, and breaking working class unity across lines of race, right? And a great historian who talks about that, one is someone named Jacqueline Badalora, another is someone named Theodore Allen. Um, and at the same time, right, African slavery is like fully entrenched into law and heavily expanded. Poor white people I recently learned were actually like mandated a lot of times, poor white men to join slave patrols. Like it wasn't an option. And which are essentially the first forces to emerge in this country, right? And despite that, like there is a legacy of multiracial resistance that persisted, on and off throughout time. But that pattern of divide and conquer was repeated, consistently. Uh, you know, Jasmine, one other thing I'll say that just might be a interest that I've also been researching recently is the connection of sort of this like Christian identity, this warped Christian identity that was used as a part of this, right? Right after that initial creation of whiteness, we see an expansion in the 1700s of settler colonialism that also impacted some of my ancestors, where all these poor Europeans at that time were brought into the back country of the colonies to literally like serve as a military buffer between the plantations of the rich and native nations trying to reclaim stolen land. Right. And we're told that, a part of the propaganda of this, right, was this warped idea of and weaponization of the book of Revelations in the Bible, right? That literally was like telling people that you are fulfilling prophecy, right? This destined prophecy where the armies of Christ will confront the armies of the Antichrist in like a battle, that in a bloody sacred war, right? And
we see
yeah,
that happen. We see
yeah,
that happening today with
right.
white Christian nationalism, and
Of course, yeah, and that's where that comes from.
it's a part of that lineage of this
Yeah.
this nation belongs to God. We have to control it, and then they come together in sort of like this populist almost a triad, right? So we've got the white Christian nationalists, we've got the white supremacists, and then we've got a section of the libertarian right funding both of these opportunities, and doing so because the libertarians' priority is to protect the market, because the market is another version of God, right? The market will decide, this invisible hand. And so you see all three of these histories and lineages coalescing into a homegrown authoritarian and far fascist movement in the United States. And so it really, really depends on racial animus. It depends on the wedge issue itself. And that's why I think that the work that you do and others who choose this intervention tactic and positionality are able to, really bring folks out of that space and help them understand that this social construct is actually only serving, corporations and the ultra elite, and that white folks who are racialized as white have more in common with a working class person of color than they do their wealthy, billionaires or oligarchs.
Yeah.
I think that you've already explained what is lost when we flatten into racialization of Black and white, but is there anything from the individual, because it's really, while this is a collective project, we matter as individuals as well. And so I'm wondering, what is lost for you as an individual, or what do you see as you teach this curriculum and these practices that others are identifying has been lost for them whenever we're racialized into a Black and white binary?
Yeah, well, number one, like across the board, right, is what you said, is solidarity. Is our capacity to see that we need each other, and to build movements that connect all of us in a sense of shared belonging. And and then I think for white people, because a lot of the folks that I work with are white identified people and like working on their stuff. When we look at like the historical process of white socialization, we see people being stripped of traditional culture and traditional political traditions that people held close. And a lot of white folks who are exploring, and kind of given a false identity, right, with this false history that's supposed to be what you identify with and what you make meaning out of. And so then when that's like delegitimized by the truth of racism, in our history, in our um, you know, by the reality of the fact that that is a racist identity, right? Um, People oftentimes, like white folks, a lot of times feel a sense of rootlessness,
Mhm.
right? Feel like this cultural, you're living in this like great white cultural void. Um, and just like a confusion about your political belonging as well. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. And threading the needle for our secular audience here, or our non-theistic audience as well, the reality is that accepting an inherited flattened identity that was a part of technologies of domination and violence inherently requires that you get rid of these beautiful tools that we have called logic and reason, right? And it requires you to not interrogate and just sort of accept this culture production. And so
Yeah.
many of us, in thinking that we're trying to undermine the project of white supremacy and racial capitalism, have said, okay, well, I'm Black, and then I'm also a good white. I'm not that version of white, but we're working from, an epigenealogical history that was, now it's actually deeper, like deepening and embedding us deeper in this project. So when we break out of it and we expand and we say, well, actually, there's some more nuance here, again, that word texture, and we see that we can look to history to teach us that whiteness is not actually a tool that is a part of a constructive world building politic. Well, then we get to use logic and reason and say, well, what can we do to create the best of all possible worlds with this finite life that we have in this moment? And I think that lends us to a different form of embodying the understanding of who we are and how we make meaning in the world.
Right.
So to that end, we have so many hidden histories. Folks are beginning to learn the truth, for example, about the Black Panthers and why they were considered so threatening. Despite propaganda and psychological operations by the United States government, the Panthers demonstrated that they could organize across class. They started organizing white people and organizing white people well. What
Mhm.
other hidden histories are there, and how is this relevant in this socio-political moment that we're in now?
Yeah.
Maybe you have like a favorite hidden history.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, well, there's tons of them, right? I mean, ultimately, it's wild what I've realized, how much this legacy of not just resistance, but like multiracial working class based resistance in US history has been like hidden from us, right? One of the reasons, one of my favorite histories that speaks to me a lot. And first, I'll say that like this has been seriously stigmatized, right? But one of the reasons why um, McCarthyism, right, was so powerful, and was because there were many chapters of the Communist Party in the United States who, unlike what J. Edgar Hoover and Joe McCarthy would have liked us to think, we're not trying to build some totalitarian state, but we're actually in this country, especially in the South, trying to create a multiracial democracy, um, and have one of the most powerful legacies of anti-racist, multiracial, working class based organizing in US history. Um, that brought people together in the 1930s and 1940s, um, to challenge racism in workplaces, to build many really powerful multiracial strands of the labor movement, to challenge lynching.
Mhm.
Um, and what they were doing was really, um, characterizes what the best of this whole legacy of resistance was doing, um, which was doing what actually this person, Reverend William Barber, who
Mhm.
maybe some of y'all have heard of, describes as showing them the trick, right? And just like having political messaging. And it's wild because looking back at some of their texts from the 1930s, like resonated with me politically more than so many things I'm reading out of people in 2023. But this concept of showing them the trick, showing white folks, but showing all people, right? That the connections between white supremacy and the corporate domination of all working people, and they created sort of a politics that both stood firmly against racism, right? And interpersonal racism, and even like put people sometimes in like racial justice education courses
Mhm.
in the 1930s in the South, right? At the height of Jim Crow. And while also having a politics that, as we've said, right, really affirmed everybody's belonging and stake and role in the movement. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I have one last question, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A and have our attendees jump in with some of their curiosities. But in your work, you talk about emotional resilience tools for navigating the work of social change and responding intentionally in charged situations.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I have seen as a licensed clinician who had a private practice, as a person who's been doing grassroots organizing for many, many years of my life, and just as a general human being and humanist, I see the ways that so many highly entrenched culture war conversations evoke a kind of physiological response. And I think this comes from a Protestant consciousness, honestly, of
Mm,
shame and fear of damnation for being bad or evil or sinful,
yeah.
and a discomfort around being able to engage with certain ideas. And then also sort of this anti-intellectualism that comes from thought crimes. Like, if I think this thing, what will
Yeah.
happen? And
Right.
because so much about our education institution encourages conformity and ideology rather than helping folks figure out how to be critical thinkers and free thinkers that really interrogate, but are able to hold belonging even when you arrive at different conclusions, right?
Right.
That one thing I love about science is multiple scientists can share an idea around a hypothesis and find different outlets for proving that hypothesis. And everyone encourages that because there's a Socratic understanding that we're creating hygiene and like we're filtering out all of the stuff that's not working and arriving at a workable place together. And
Yeah.
then also holding space for a future where we recognize as scientists and folks who love scientific method that the future is yet to be determined. And so we're still going somewhere. It hasn't ended now that we have come to some, a point.
Yeah.
And so with that, we want to give folks actual concrete tools. So when you talk about emotional resilience tools, maybe give us like one or two quick outlines of what does this mean for folks who want to do this work in the lineages and traditions that you come from? What does emotional resilience tool mean? And name one of them, one or two of them.
Yeah. Well, just real quick, first I'll just say, like, I totally resonate with the connection of Protestantism, right, from a lot of that culture, right? There's this article that folks should look up called "Excommunicate Me from the Church of Social Justice," um, which is all about like these parallels between this person who's basically grew up in an evangelical community and was felt suppressed by that culture, and drew all these parallels, actually, many of which you just said, between that and then some of these like punitive strands of social justice culture we see today. But I think number one resilience tool is simply like finding community um, that is also seeking kind of a different way of being, where we can be real with each other and speak to the uniqueness of our identity and our experiences based in our identity, right, while also holding to that collective belonging,
Mhm.
and collective politics. But in terms of like some specific tools, for white folks that I've worked with people around, one is a simple basic thing, right? Because so often, like, you can have a shame response and go into that place of like fight, flight, or freeze.
Mhm.
Um, Number one thing is like this term from a psychologist, I think that we talk about sometimes. Um, that is name it to tame it. So it's like realizing in the moment when you're in like a charged conversation, about race, or about even about something that maybe you did that was harmful or hurtful to someone, um, and you start to spiral and go into that place, to just pause, and take a breath and, um, just name like, oh, I'm going into this thing again. Like, and I know when I go into this response that that's like not actually the full reality of the situation here, right? That's like my pattern of getting brought into this and getting triggered in this, and almost like naming the reality that you're going into that fight, flight, or freeze place to yourself can just help you be like, oh, reassurance, like, right,
Mhm.
I do belong. Like this is not the fullness of the reality. And that, like, just naming what's happening in your body to yourself can create a lot more groundedness. um, and then, like, other outside of like in the moment stuff, I just think, for white folks, a lot of times, like, one of the ways in which I've seen sort of like anti-racist communities of white people be positive is in creating like spaces of collective vulnerability and collective acceptance, for where everyone is just like sharing about like their emotional struggle with this stuff in a place of like collective vulnerability. And when you can like share about difficult emotional stuff for you, as we all know, in different contexts of our lives with all sorts of different topics, right, in a place where you're accepted and other people are doing the same, those things can start to move through, and then you can like exist in the world with a much more grounded state and open heart when dealing with a lot of these topics.
Yeah, yeah. What was really helpful for me came from a resource created with the Constructive Dialogue Institute, because I found myself in these places where I wanted to bridge and I wanted to build coalition with people that I knew were different than me. But I would have um, this energy that would come up in me that say, like, how could you ask me to have a civil conversation with someone whose actual group is trying to undermine my right to exist? And so
Right.
even this conversation is happening within the context of all of us figuring out how do we address systemic inequality from the past that is still impacting the present,
Yeah.
while abandoning the race trap, right? And moving forward into a conversation where we center our humanity. We understand that there are material conditions still that those of us who are from working class communities especially are living underneath, and that within that there's also even more nuance related to how race keeps being brought forward into our current moment. And so
Yeah.
it's a lot to hold. It takes a lot of
Yeah.
complexity. And because there has been such a good long-term strategy around narrative that has been financed deeply by corporations and aided and abetted by religious institutions, and then our education system not being one that provides us a real deep understanding of our history and critical thinking skills, it sort of created this toxic soup of the moment that we're in, of rising authoritarianism and toxic polarization. So thank you so much for sharing about your lineages and your way that you engage in this work. We're going to open it
Yeah.
up to questions. And Sarah, do you have our questions ready for David? She's getting there.
Hello. Um,
Hey.
Paul Warren asks, I'm about to graduate with a master's degree in clinical social work and would like to learn how to counsel other white people as they undo whiteness. Any idea where I might learn to do that?
um yeah, well, actually, so the organization that I worked for full time for a while as associate director and still support and do some work with now is called White Awake. And they lead online courses year round, primarily for white identified folks, um, that relate to all of this stuff that we're talking about. And actually, that more and more they've created, the fall course that is their foundations course now has like a social work continuing education track. And so it's also right, like there's a whole track to it that's supporting social workers too. white social workers to deal with these issues and integrate that into their practice.
Great, thank you. I'm going to invite Dr. Shoemaker to come on and speak. Please keep your question to a question, and then we'll toss it over to David to answer. All right. Hi, Dr. Shoemaker. You're welcome to come on camera if you'd like.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Hi.
I don't have a camera link, but I can say the question. I appreciate your a point of view on this, David, and that Jasmine, you and Sarah are putting this together. Very quickly, I just want to tell you a story about my exposure. Back when I had just graduated from university, I had missed out on being able to play professional basketball due to an injury, and I was recruited to go back and teach school and work with Black athletes in Harlem in the 60s. And this is after a very unstable time. And the leader of our group was a very educated Black man from Princeton. And one of the first things he told us, David, was, you are here to teach these students and help them move on in their education, but get off your effing white horse. You're not going to save them because they view you as their enemy. So if you go into their classroom, you need to understand you're teaching people that basically probably don't trust most of the things you say. That experience changed me for the rest of my life. And it's because I had to get off my high horse, even though I went on to get a PhD and all that kind of stuff. Whenever I was teaching people of a multiracial class, I always tried to take the stance that if I didn't involve them in this dialogue and help me even construct the class, they would often view me not as someone that was going to be helpful. So my question to you is, David, in your white awareness program, I think you call it White Awakening, do you have projects that are biracial so that you're not just sending out white people or white people are just writing books? Do you have some kind of co-racial kind of partnership going on to always keep our biases in a real life discussion going on? I've always found that very valuable rather than just working alone.
Yeah, thank you for that question. We're putting you back on mute. Thanks, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I actually was a basketball player in high school and college as well. So that question is an important one, and White Awake has some partnerships as well as just has an effort to plug folks into organizations. One of which is an organization called People's Action, and there are others as well. The Poor People's Campaign is something that I think resonates with that they direct people towards, as well as some other things. But yeah, I mean, I think, so often, especially for like middle class white folks, the form of sort of social engagement that is given to them is this sort of like doing to type thing in working class communities of color. And the setup is not really one where real comradeship can often easily evolve. And I think, there are a lot of efforts that are bringing together ordinary people across lines of race in this country, to build political power together, right? And to identify intersecting needs and shared interests, as well as unique struggles, but to build a coalition based in mutual interest. And a mentor of mine talks about how when people can get in a foxhole together, right? And that's obviously a military metaphor, but it serves a purpose in some ways. Like when people are really in shared struggle, where they all know that they have a stake in it, and that they need each other. Actually, some of the more powerful forms of sort of like bias transformation can actually happen. And, we can reclaim a lot of what was lost with our racialization. But it takes, a shared struggle where you're in it for yourselves and for one another, right? And versus this sort of like helper type model that we're often given.
Yeah, which also goes back to that religious indoctrination and the
Yeah.
trope of the savior, right? Like the
Right.
Protestant consciousness says you must descend down into the filthy masses of humanity and save them like the Messiah did, right? And so white saviorism or white allies often becomes another way that Protestant consciousness can express itself, which I always find very interesting, especially for those of us in the secular spaces that claim to have deconstructed from religiosity. We seem to have habits where we can find our ways back to orthodoxy, dogma, and purity litmus tests, and that we just put racialization on top of it, right? So another question from Ashok Varma. Thanks very much. Great program. What can we do to empower people of color where the attitude is success is the best revenge? For example, many of my friends who are humanists and free thinkers are Jewish. Shout out to the secular Jews. Their ancestors suffered discrimination almost every place on the planet. They were kicked out of the places where generations of their ancestors worked hard and prospered, migrating to distant places. Their way of revenge was success. They worked hard, stayed focused in their work to succeed. So again, the question is, what can we do to empower people of color where the attitude is success is the best revenge? And I'll say a side note that there seems like some hidden meritocracy in that question, but my little antennas came up. But David, could you answer that?
Yeah. Yeah. And you're welcome to throw in any thoughts too. But my first thought is, I mean, and relates to folks of color and also relates to everybody too, I think, is this idea that like when you live in a capitalist society, right, as someone who has to work to live, I think first like validating that like people need to survive and like there are things we have to do to survive in this system. And so pursuing economic security is understandable. Right. And I think the thing that is more important is developing a politics that critiques the entire system and seeks to change it, right? And doesn't just seek to like create diversity capitalism or equal opportunity capitalism where still the vast majority of everyone is not having their needs met. So that's a thought is the important thing is that we develop a politics and a form of political engagement that challenges this entire system, even if like, we're trying to survive within it. That's some thoughts.
Got it. Eddie asked the question, given that the research shows that implicit bias has very poor construct validity, is it useful to present as if there is more evidence of it than actually exists?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know a ton about this like whole debate. I think like the implicit bias tests themselves maybe like had some issues with like how they worked. And so people kind of got up in arms about like that as a concept. But I mean, like the concept of unconscious bias is like, to me, you don't even need research. Like, it's just like, if you look at history and you see the ways in which people have been socialized in explicit and implicit ways to think all of these things, right? To like the billions of dollars that went into ads in the 90s to, and political campaigns to, pathologize Black men as violent, like impacted people in my family who are white, like no question. And they don't even, and it's unconscious, right? So I think if we think about it and we see that history of propaganda, and then we really look at like ourselves and other people around us, like unconscious bias is a thing. So That's my response.
Yeah. I think sometimes we get in these conversations and folks, especially those who come from certain scientific traditions, expect everyone to have a lens. And I want to make sure that we're being really clear about your lens. Your lens is coming as a social cultural organizer, right? And an organizer that is about changing the story and giving folks on the grassroots level skills. And that does not always translate into other fields in certain ways, right? We're certainly seeing emerging emerging theories around this, around social psychology in particular, anthropology, sociology. Folks are bringing that into an interdisciplinarian space, but it's an emerging thing. And so it's really exciting to be discussing these ideas together. Carol wants to know if you can please say more about how folks who identify as white will benefit from a more just society.
Yeah, I mean, I think
before you jump in, I think off jump as a secular humanist, we get to say that white people have new lineages, right? Like how they'll benefit is they won't be birthed into a legacy of violence, right? And saying, oh, just because you're white, you're violent, you actually get more space to own your humanity. But please, you go ahead and explain from your perspective how folks who identify as white will benefit from a more just society.
Yeah, I mean, so I think, like you said, on a the basis of our humanity and connection to morality and connection to creating a new course from this and reconnecting in some ways to legacies of resistance that we've been separated from, and creating a sense of belonging there. And then I think, like we've said and I do think this is just important for those of us who want to engage in political organizing to center in our work, is just this reality that, building a multiracial movement with the power to fundamentally change this society and create, democratically controlled workplaces, to create a true democracy in this government, where ordinary people have their needs met, have healthcare, have just their basic needs met, and even and not the fear that because there is nothing to hold them if hard times come along, right, that they're just gonna suffer. That the only way to get there is a multiracial, powerful movement. And this idea also, right, like white people in different ways, right, like have forms of comparative advantage under this system of racial capitalism. But most of us, all still have to live in this society of such scarcity. And that is a constant anxiety and many times a literal survival threat. And that is something that has the potential to change when we create a better society for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we think about the overlapping crises that we are experiencing within so many institutions, systems, and structures, whenever I look at someone who's done a ton of community organizing on what has kept us from taking meaningful action around certain things, it was because we got entrenched in these very fabricated ways of constantly looking at the past in a way that doesn't serve us and bring us into a future where we're cooperating and where we're collaborating. And I think one of the most beautiful things about our species is that we know how to cooperate and we can build tools together, but there's also old wiring in our brain that says that we have to war with one another and that we have to compete in order to survive. And so it becomes very easy for us to get in these silos and create us versus them instead of having a shared humanity. And one way that we create us versus them is through the racialization of both Black and white people. And while we're trying to figure that out instead of offering a solution that brings us to a final destination that is colorblind, we actually acknowledge the ethnicity, we acknowledge the vibrancy, and we create practices rooted in evidence, logic, and reason that say we can stay in deep connection with people, with folks that we disagree with. That's what makes us so unique. And also we're part of the ecosystem, right? And planet Earth, and that's how other ecosystems survive. So it's about time we start acting like we belong. So thank you so much for your time, David. This has been a really rich and exciting conversation. Everyone, we will be producing and packaging this video, as well as sending out follow-up resources. We know this is a sticky topic for so many people. We know it evokes all kinds of feelings and ideas and thoughts. We know that so many folks, much smarter and more capable than the three of us together, have also tried to tackle it. But the point of this moment is to hold a conversation, to invite ideas, to not be afraid of thought crimes, and to wrestle together with how are we trying to intervene? What tools can we use? And I definitely, from a personal perspective, think that David's tools and the lineages you come from can be useful for that fight. We will be in touch, and thank you everyone for joining us.